Christianity. So if from this book at least we won't be able to find out what he was going to. He died not long after having wrote it out. So that reviews inevitably came to be mixed with appraisals of his entire quite remarkable academic career. This is what also happened to that, I was going to write that awful, but I will say that impossible book of Roy Rappaport on ritual and religion in the making of humanity, which derives at least some of its intellectual power from the fact that it was written in the face of an inevitable and swiftly arriving death. Bella uses Rappaport, of course, and both Bella and Rappaport struggle, as do most, with Durkheim. Both works, incidentally, have been hailed. If you ever wondered what's the style figure hyperbole means, this is, I think, a textbook example of it. Now, Stark is much more in line with Weber, with his unrepentant modern Western triumphalism, and actually with all of his logic. I don't know if you have vivid memories of the preface Weber added to his publication of Die protestantische Ethik in the first volume of his Gesammelte Aufsätze zur Religionssoziologie. If you don't have these memories, don't read it. You will never again be able to take Weber as seriously as he possibly deserves. It is basically a very long litany of all the areas in which the West, and only the West, has reached perfection against the dim-witted attempts of all the others. The centerpiece of his demonstration is the fact that only the West has developed the symphony orchestra on the basis of the string quartet with all the correct instruments. In his recent and very important festive lecture to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the South Asia Institute in Heidelberg, Sheldon Pollock has shown with painful and meticulous precision how there is a direct line between this logic of Weber and the current and probably future situation of the humanities. Study the productions, which in Weber's appraisal we should not consider seriously as contributions to anything, basically. Now you must be wondering where all this is heading, and so am I, I'm afraid. I'm supposed to teach a course next year, which in its title and its layout goes back to Jan Platvoet's Wraak van de Primitieven. It will be an attempt, in other words, to cover the general history of religion with a global focus. That is also why I've taken Jan's article from my shelves and the three books I just mentioned. And I have to say, as I said when I welcomed you this morning, what Jan has written is much better and much more important to me than the other things I've been able to find. And I would like to use my time, if I have some, to reflect a little bit on why this might be the case. In his article, Jan distinguishes 6 types of society, with some historical progression in them, and distinguishes 6 types of religion, which correspond and do not correspond at the same time with these 6 types of society and of periods of history. And I think it is in this final edition, Periods of History, which I have made, and which you will not find in Jan's article, that my problems begin, and I think I can summarize them in the single term axiality. I can see, I think, but you'll probably enlighten me, I can see why social scientists need or like the concept. For them, I guess, it is the necessary link between basically the evolutionary logic they apply to pre-axial human cultures and the historical interpretation they want to begin with the axial transformation. But 70 years of constant manipulation have left little room, I think, for historians to continue to uphold the notion of an axial age. Let me explain why. Of course, Karl Jaspers did not invent the concept of the axial age. He did invent the word, and he made the notion popular. Long before him, people had noticed that a series of individuals held to be responsible for some of the major religious and philosophical systems of the world were once considered to have been contemporaries. The first person actually to point at this, it shall not surprise you coming from me, was Anquetil du Perron, who brought back the Avesta and who was the founder of the study of Zoroastrianism. The novel Creation by Gore Vidal is based on the whole idea, and this notion lined up from east to west Confucius and Laozi, the Buddha, Mahavira, the Upanishadic sages including Yajnavalkya, Zarathustra, the Hebrew prophets, at least second Isaiah, and Socrates. such a lineup, and this is the way it all has always been presented, such a lineup could not be a coincidence. Although no sufficient reason has ever been given why this could not be a coincidence. Historians have cast doubt, moreover, on the historical existence of a number of persons in this list, and they have moved many or even most of them away from the 6th century. Some of them to a period much earlier, Zarathustra, at least for those who believe there ever was such a person, and some, most actually, to later times, to the 5th or to the 4th century. This happened to the Buddha, to Laozi, to the 6th, and if the dating of Mahavira continues to be tied up with the Buddha, he probably also has to be relegated to the 5th century BCE. Well, if we leave these two, we would leave them in the 6th century, but this is what bothers me all the time. It's much more about us than it is about the 6th century. So most scholars have therefore somehow abandoned the notion of the actual period in the 6th century, and they have started to think in a very, very long axial period, spanning at least a millennium, adding, moreover, a second axial period that would eventually lead us into modernity, or that we're currently in. Some people say it started with the Reformation, other people. At this point, for me at least, but you may challenge me on this, the whole notion of axiality has by now lost much of its meaning, as it had always done, I think, for most historians. Right? So the axial age and the second axial age are explanatory strategies that need to illustrate how human cultures could have grown into us. They thereby carry a double moral impact. One, that's obvious, is it has a moral content. Right? The axial transformation is supposed to have been sort of the sponsor of morality as a central element of thought and practice, including religious thought and practice. And the other role morality plays is certainly an unacceptable one, and this is that we sort of consider ourselves to be the heirs of this axial transformation. It is a really good thing that we reap the benefits of this transformation, which turned us, unlike those who did not go through this transformation apparently, into more decent, more moral, more religious, or in modern times, more cognitively optimal beings, with one further transformation awaiting us in history, the transformation that would transform us into modern human beings, beyond religion, beyond tradition. But by now I think you will have realized that I, as a historian, I just can't deal with it very easily. This is what I always tell my students, I don't think moral evaluations are part of I don't think our field should only seek answers to questions about ourselves. How did we come to be the persons we are? I don't think modern man is completely different from pre-modern man, and I don't think pre-axial man was very different either. I apologize to Wouter for the gender exclusive words. So these are my problems, but here's the thing. I do think that a general history of religion is worthwhile as an effort. To be worthwhile, however, it needs to become more historical. It needs to question and to test the enthusiastic use of evolutionary history, and especially of evolutionary psychology, to account for early human cultures and for the origin of religion, which more often than not, in my limited appraisal of the work done in this field, often totters on the edge of pseudoscience, or at the very least does not come very much further than well-fed, middle-aged, lapsed Christian men with well-endowed bank accounts pondering what life would have been like as an early hominid on the steppes of Africa, and using the evidence thus assembled to explain religion as a colossal misunderstanding that they now hope to correct. I'm not sure where I am in the here, probably, in the PowerPoint. I'm carried away a little bit. So it's not strange, I hope you will agree, that someone working on the development of Buddhist monasticism, or early Persian mystical poetry, on the theological underpinnings of the Quaker rejection of ritual, or on heresy trials in the 13th century Midi, will not find any of this work, however self-confidently it is presented as real science, useful. And they do not, in fact. And a general history of religion, when attempted, should before all else prove to be useful. The history that can be covered in depth, which excludes obviously much of prehistory, is far too short for an evolutionary approach to be seriously attempted. And I fear, as I said, that the axial age has somehow been smuggled in to stop the evolutionary focus and start the historical one. So this is why I wrote somewhere it was a plug. It needs to be pushed in somewhere. But the history thus written, so I think most of the work I've been seeing on this general history of religion has very little room for the impact of individuals, and thus takes leave of the foundations of the axial age, at least the original formulation of it, which was very much pinned on a series of extraordinary individuals. And this is really difficult, right? It is as easy. I mean, there are two easy options. The first easy option is to have a historical reconstruction of developments in which we maximize the role played by individuals. This is what we've always been doing. If I read my children's school books on the Reformation, it's all about Luther and how bad the Catholic Church was, as if nothing in the study of the Reformation has changed in 400 years. So it's possible. You can sort of maximize this individual impact, but with equal simplicity you can completely debunk this and argue for deeper structures. So the trick will be, therefore, I guess, to develop a scheme that will yield typological or taxonomic benefit in distinguishing various manifestations of religion or religions, but will maintain thinking space for individual changes and individual contributions. Now, one of the parts of that scheme, I'll close in a minute. One of the parts of that scheme, the one I'm going to discuss with you briefly, because I only began to think about this in conversation with Jong, concerns complexity and simplicity. We agree, Jan and I hope we still agree, that the religions of antiquity are more complex than the so-called world religions. And we also agree that the religions of early food-producing societies are more complex than the community religions of the ancient world. And there are obvious reasons for this, especially for the difference in complexity between the ancient and the missionary religions. Right? Trans-societal religions need to think about themselves, and they need to summarize their main points, and they need to be learnable in efficient ways. Otherwise, you have no hope of ever converting your neighbor. So they therefore tend to withdraw on a small number of highly significant, often discursive aspects which function as sort of a summary. I choose to be a worshipper of Mazda, like Zarathustra. I reject the Daivas, I accept the doctrine of the Ahuras, or there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. The same simplification, the same summarization is true for ritual. This tends to become standardized, professionalized, and simplified, with a single pattern adapted for various purposes. No longer the situation you would have faced in the ancient world, and you still face in the Hindu world, where every temple has to advertise its precise rules for visitors and pilgrims. We have the inscriptions from antiquity, and you can still see them certainly on Bali and in South India. So complexity in the trans-societal religions comes in at a different moment. I'm obviously not denying that Christianity is a very complex world, more complex perhaps than Greek society, but it is a complexity on a very much shrunk and predefined territory, and that makes a real difference. So I shall end with a question, hoping that Jan or someone else will answer it for me. In a central passage of Religion and Human Evolution, Bella writes, and I quote, "At this point it might be well to remember one of the central principles of this inquiry: nothing is ever lost." And if you Google "nothing is ever lost," you come to hundreds. And he uses this oracular saying, which is so easily disproved. I was thinking, make also in a less mundane way. It is so easily disproved. He uses this saying to express a sentiment that we all recognize, and that has become part of a popular understanding of reality, sort of that our ancestors live on in ourselves, and their culture lives on in ours. And I can sort of live with that feeling as just that. But I do think that the statement "nothing is ever lost" is so fundamentally wrong that it sets Bella's whole project on a course towards a canyon into which it must fall, and indeed fell. For the question would not be how things we once thought lost actually survive in different guises. That is a truism. The question should be, if there are ways to understand why some aspects do in fact exist, whereas others manage to sort of transform themselves and live on. The question needs to be asked, therefore, how religions die. And that is a question neither of the three books mentioned, and not even Jan Platvoet's pioneering article, has ever attempted to answer. Thank you very much for your attention.